On September 2nd, 1679, a major earthquake shook the capital. Over 10,000 people died inside and outside the royal city. However, inside the prison, one prisoner on death row was saved because of this. He was the director of the Imperial Observatory of the Qing Dynasty, Johann Adam Schall von Bell. Prior to the earthquake, he was charged with confusing the public and rebellion due to spreading the Western calendar. The occurrence of the earthquake led the ruler to believe the heavens were angered, and Schall von Bell was held responsible. A few years later, Schall von Bell's name was finally cleared at Emperor Kangxi's declaration. Legend has it that Emperor Kangxi was repaying a debt. 20 years earlier, Emperor Shunji, who was merely 24, was dying, yet his successor was still undecided. It was Schall von Bell who recommended his mediocre third son, Xuanye, as he had had smallpox before and was thus less likely to die young. This would cause less frequent unrest in the Qing Empire. Fortunately, Xuanye was naturally diligent in learning and loved reading. Not only did he work hard on Han culture, he was also deeply interested in Western natural sciences. His teachers on Western science just happened to be those missionaries in black. Perhaps that was why Schall von Bell's name was cleared. Some scholars say Kangxi was the only emperor in Chinese history who was learned in both Chinese and Western studies. In the 23rd year of the Kangxi regime, a royal order was issued from the Forbidden City. At this time of unification and peace, the Han and Manchurian people living together as one, maritime trade should be carried out to promote this prosperous regime. The country is henceforth open to maritime trade. Thus, the golden age of open maritime trade was once again upon the country. Overseas trade and cultural exchange between the East and the West blossomed once again. Merchant groups and diplomatic corps flowed in, and among them, of course, were missionaries bearing Bibles. In 1705, in the porcelain town of Jingde, a French missionary, Père François Xavier de Entrecol, quietly stepped off a ship with a hint of curiosity in his eyes.
When we entered the harbor through the narrow pass, I saw such a scene. Flames and smoke rising up everywhere highlighted the impressive outline of Jingde town. At night, it looked like a giant city surrounded by flames, as well as a giant furnace with chimneys everywhere.
Letters from Father d'Entrecol, who wrote of the first observations by a Westerner of ceramic production in Jingde. And this is our very first insight into how ceramics were made in China. Until that point, nobody really knew.
Today, Jingde town has been around for over 1,000 years. Times may have changed, but it has never stopped making porcelain. It permeates the air on the streets and penetrates people's blood. Looking back in history, there's probably no country or town who has passed on a single craft and industry for as long as it has. Hence its name, Porcelain Capital. Sanbao is a small village in Jingde town, famous since the Song dynasty for being a source of raw material for shadowy blue glazed porcelain. The ancient gravel water-powered trip hammer churns the steam water still. The high-pitched ramming of the stones echo in the valley just as before. This not only captured the attention of the missionary who first arrived 300 years ago, it also stunned these Dutch artists. They made this trip in hopes of using local porcelain clay and traditional techniques to finish the contemporary porcelain work that they have designed in realization of a sort of perfect integration. When they first laid hands on the porcelain clay of Jingde town, the scene itself was already a vivid moment in history.
More than 400 years ago, Holland was in war with Portugal, and they captured one of the ships and they stole the porcelain from that ship and brought the porcelain to Holland, and it became enormously popular in Holland because nobody knew that material and the quality, and they called it the white gold.
Ever since the Dutch hijacked and auctioned off the 100,000 Chinese porcelain items from the Portuguese merchant ship in 1604, that excellent craftsmanship and huge profit stimulated them and drew them in to becoming true fanatics. The entire Netherlands made it very clear their yearning for wealth. Thus the three-colored Dutch flag was seen all over the oceans of the world. In 1656, the Netherlands Diplomatic Corps reached China. It had only been 8 years since the Manchurians conquered Beijing, but they had already learned the conceited arrogance of a powerful kingdom and had the Dutch waiting for a full 85 days. Under the motivation of profit, the Dutch were patient and even sent their greetings repeatedly. In the end, though, all they received was permission for tributary trade once every 8 years. It turned out that the missionaries, who were looking out for the profits of all parties, didn't want the Dutch to dominate. Despite that, the Dutch lived up to their nickname as coachmen of the seas. Believed that from the late Ming to early Qing dynasty, the number of Chinese porcelain items exported around the world through the Dutch East India Company exceeded 60 million.
In the late 17th and early 18th century, they liked to have silk, paintings from China, wood blocks, and everything which came from the Orient.
Unlike the missionaries close to the emperor, the Frenchman d'Entrecoll, who was in Jingde town, was mostly in touch with common kiln workers. However, instead of leaving, d'Entrecoll bribed the local officials, who made an exception for him to stay and preach. Yet, was that all that he did? It is undeniable that since the first missionaries landed in the late Ming Dynasty, their leaders brought advanced scientific knowledge from the West and from an objective perspective opened a window to the world for China. Leaders like Ritchie, Charles von Bell, and Verbiest. With regards to this, Kangxi expressed full acknowledgement, which was reflected in calendar administration, the supervision and construction of artillery, the assistance to the court in signing of the Treaty of Nerchinsk with Russia. However, their ultimate goal remained preaching their religion. And some were even tasked with more than just that, as d'Entrecoll admits to in his letters.
As I converted and accumulated followers in Jingde town, I got the chance to study the manufacturing process of the beautiful porcelain that is highly acclaimed around the world. It isn't out of curiosity that I ventured into this field, but because I believe a detailed record of porcelain manufacturing would prove useful for Europe to a certain extent.
Since its conception in Eastern Han to the Qing dynasty, Chinese porcelain has already had a history of 1,500 years. How, though, despite the beginning of porcelain export in the Tang dynasty and the use of Chinese porcelain as a national gift in the Ming dynasty, in an age without the protection of patents, did porcelain making remain an exclusive craft to the Chinese? Both Japan and Europe's pottery were top-notch in quality, yet they were still ceramics. Replicas remained a long-time trend in both Europe and Asia, and only with the rise of strong naval countries in the Age of Discovery did they manage to penetrate the core of the kingdom of porcelain.
It's until the 16th century they described places all over the world that he had never been to. It's quite similar to a Chinese classical text called Classic of the Mountains and Seas. Some are portrayed as men without heads or some with eyes in their chests. So many strange mythical books like this, which contain this kind of drawing and description.
However, in the same year d'Entrecoll arrived in Jingde town, a government official also sailed down the same river to the same port, Jiangxi governor Lang Tingji. As customs went, it was commonplace for a newly appointed official to inspect his assigned territory. However, this senior official soon removed his official robes and dived into the kiln grounds. It turned out he had another mission. Two outsiders, one ancient town, one on the emperor's orders, the other representing the church. One Chinese, one Westerner, bound to run into each other, yet both with the same target, porcelain. The difference was that while d'Entrecoll was still secretly learning the craft of porcelain making, Lang Tingji was looking to innovate. D'Entrecoll wanted merchandise. Lang Tingji wanted classics. Coincidentally, a reflection of the two destinies of the porcelain of that era. It was a secret war on two sides of the same wall. Records showed that d'Entrecoll once asked Lang Tingji to present 66 bottles of French wine to Emperor Kangxi, strange bedfellows over Kangxi's wine glass. As if this porcelain war wasn't raging enough, at the same time, on the other side of the earth, an alchemist called Johann Friedrich Büttger was also praying for porcelain. Dresden is the second largest city in Germany. Dresden Castle, the construction of which started in the 13th century and lasted 400 years, was completely made of volcanic rock. Over time, the rock has turned completely black, and it witnessed all the upheavals during this period. In the early 18th century, King Augustus II, a porcelain fanatic, obsessed over the priceless porcelain. His mind turned to Butger, and he imprisoned him in the castle to have him make porcelain with alchemy. The day he was successful would be the day he was freed.
In Dresden and with Augustus the Strong, he was absolutely fascinated with Oriental porcelain. He wanted to make porcelain manufacture a kind of profitable business for his country, for Saxony. So he actually forced this poor Butger to invent it.
Thus Lang Tingji, D'Entrecol, and Butger, three people from three kingdoms, unknowingly all had their destinies intertwined with porcelain. In comparison, Lang Tingji was in much better circumstances. He had the power to mobilize quality resources and experience accumulated by his ancestors. Therefore, he was able to build upon the Wu Tai created by another official supervisor, Zhang Yichuan, 20 years before, and create Kangxi Wu Tai, which was even more vivid in color. During Kangxi's regime, Chinese porcelain underwent another period of major development. Westerners even made the sweeping generalization of Kangxi Wu Tai as Kangxi art or Chinese art. It's a symbol of the maturity and ultimate perfection of Wu Tai porcelain, and directly influenced Fan Tai, Falang Tai, and Guang Tai porcelain, which came afterwards. When the results of this art sailed over the sea, added with the damage and risk along the way, it naturally became what the Europeans called white gold, and it wouldn't be hard to understand Augustus II's obsession with it. Holborn Museum, Bath, England. In the 19th century, the wealthy merchant Holborn bought a large amount of Chinese porcelain due to his geographical advantage of being in India, and transported them back to England. Many of these items are now among the museum collection.
What we have here are all pieces of Chinese export ware made in Jingzhen, especially for the European market. If we turn it over, you'll see it's all cracked. But because porcelain was so expensive and so valuable, they haven't thrown it away. And because they didn't have very strong glues at this date, they've used metal rivets to glue it back together again and to extend its life. And nearly half of all the pieces in this service have been repaired like this. So this is how important this porcelain was considered.
Even in China, the birthplace of porcelain, a similar situation exists. Among Mr. Lu Jingming's collection, there is a dizzying array of Wu Tai porcelain. Within this category, this night-hunting porcelain plate is his prized collection. The reason lies on its backside. This porcelain plate, almost 40 centimeters in diameter, was pieced together with crisscrossed staples. Only an owner who loved it as their own child would have treasured a broken item like that. It was a repeat of the porcelain plate on the other side of the ocean. Was it mere coincidence?
This porcelain plate was broken and had almost 83 staples on it. You can imagine how much the owner of this plate loved and treasured this. Not that it is particularly beautiful, but the effort put behind it touches me.
Despite Lang Tingji's victory in the first battle in Jingde town, the real challenge was yet to come. In Dresden, the imprisoned Butger was still at a loss, trapped in the darkness of the dungeon. He had already exhausted all his ways in alchemy, but the dark, magic-like experiments were unable to derive the components of porcelain. In 1694, a French scholar believed Chinese porcelain was made from seashells and the like. It was a popular notion in the West at the time. With such misleading theories, Butker was left, of course, floundering even more. He seemed to have gone down the same path as the Italian and the Dutch in making replicas. The same question plagued d'Entrecourt, but he was much more lucky than Butker. Although he could only spy in secret, he could, at least, walk around freely, and he had the advantage of being in the town of porcelain itself. One day, he finally heard the word Kalen from the kiln workers. His sensitive instincts told him he was close to the gate to the treasure. Thus, he followed this trail and finally found a village named Gaolin in the mountains. One could imagine his ecstasy the first time he saw Kalen in its most original form. Imagine his difficulty in maintaining his reserved facade as a priest.
A wealthy merchant said some years ago, the Dutch brought white feldspar back to the Netherlands to try to make porcelain. But without kaolin, they failed in the end. They were trying to build a sturdy body with muscle alone and no skeleton. Without that, we can't make porcelain.
This factual description revealed a huge secret. White feldspar was neither hard enough nor tensile enough for firing true hard porcelain.
It's the same today, copyright issues. If you have a product, you don't want anyone copying it because it's your product, you want to protect it.
I think as a great agricultural empire, they have their own thinking on ensuring their own security and national security. They didn't think like, this commercial secret is so important, so I have to protect this only secret. In other words, they protect everything. That's how they think.
The Chinese might not have kept it secret intentionally, but kaolin was indeed the key to the exclusivity of Chinese porcelain for over 1,000 years. However, when d'Entrecourt finally found out this secret, he became even more cautious. d'Entrecourt was secretly rejoicing. Lang Tingji, on the other hand, was troubled over a kind of porcelain with a very low success rate, Ji Hong. This rich, heavy, dazzling porcelain vase is Ji Hong. It was made during the Yongxuan regime in the Ming Dynasty. The Ming people described it as the color of a red sunset, the king of all classic porcelain. Unfortunately, its life ended soon after it was born. It was said that due to the sky-high manufacturing cost, success couldn't be guaranteed, despite the treasured raw materials. It was titled The Treasure of 1,000 Kilns. However, to the Emperor Kangxi, the treasure of 1,000 kilns was fitting for the Emperor of 1,000 years. Manchurian emperors felt strongly about integrating with Chinese culture and yearned to recreate all famous and valuable treasures from past dynasties. Thus, they didn't mind imitation or replication. Under such circumstances, Lang Tingji faced enormous pressure. Thus he set decorum and status aside and went to the kilns himself, spending all his time with the kiln workers in repeated experimentation, even at the cost of large quantities of coral and agate. Unfortunately, he was still unable to make true, pure Ji Hong. No wonder there was a saying that if one wants to be poor, fire Lang Tingji's kiln. At that time, Lang Tingji was oblivious to the desperate frenzy another man in his same situation felt, tens of thousands of miles away in Dresden Castle. Over the course of several years, Butger had been allowed limited activity on nearby grounds, but only to look for materials for making porcelain. He was at his wit's end and mentally and physically drained, yet still had no idea how to make hard porcelain. He couldn't find any glimmer of hope, and only the sword of Augustus II hung over his head, a constant reminder. Yet for d'Entrecolle, the path seemed to be smoothing out. He had been in Jingde town for 5 years now, and no one gave him a second glance as he moved around. On the contrary, he would be greeted by other missionaries. Compared to the stubborn, rigid Germans, the French seemed to be more flexible and open to change. If he wasn't a missionary, he might have been a smart businessman, a seasoned spy, or even a successful scientist. At that time, he had already secretly figured out the ratio of kaolin in making porcelain, and was about to send the knowledge to his headquarters in France.
Making quality porcelain requires an equal amount of kaolin and white feldspar. For porcelain of average quality, the ratio of kaolin to white feldspar is 4 to 6. However, there must be a minimum ratio of 1 to 3 in the amount of kaolin to white feldspar in porcelain.
If this formula, not unlike some secret martial arts manual, could have reached Butger sooner in Dresden, or if he had at least heard about the experiences of his counterparts in China from d'Entrecolle, maybe he wouldn't be so troubled. By some stroke of luck, Lang Tingji finally brought Jihong back to life after several years. Jihong is, in fact, a kind of high-temperature copper-red glaze called Lang's Kiln Red. However, scholars confirm that Kangxi Jihong was a replica, while Lang Yao Red was original. They were both made out of Lang Tingji's Lang's Kiln, yet each had their own highlights. The steps of civilization often coincidentally converge in the same period of history, albeit in completely different places. As Lang Tingji was raising a glass to celebrate his success, the Saxons on the other side of Europe were holding another celebration. Butger finally walked out of the castle. His hard work had paid off. Although he still didn't know what kaolin was, he found a similar material in Saxon, and original hard porcelain from Europe was presented at the banquet. On the 10th of January 1710, Augustus II smugly announced he discovered the street secret behind porcelain manufacturing and set up his porcelain factory in Meissen, another ancient town. In Albrechtsberg, Germany, the earliest porcelain factory site back then, there are 2 wall paintings, both of which are related to that legend.
Oh, hello. You're here in the Böttger Zimmer with a wall painting from Johann Friedrich Böttger. Shows the Prince Elector from Saxony, August the Strong, the first European porcelain in 1710.
Johann Böttger's copper statue is still standing in Meissen's porcelain factory. Even more alluring is the collection of 700,000 mold pieces that have been preserved. Because of them, most of the porcelain items that were made in the past 300 years can be replicated at any time. How can we quickly find the mold pieces we want in this sea of molds, though? He uses an index for the mold pieces. It may be spotted, yellowed, and even torn, but still simple and practical. Before the computer was invented, this could be the most precise mode of retrieval. Porcelain from Meissen, Germany is famous for its intricate decoration and lifelike design. Even to this day, we can still see the exaggerated imagination Europeans from the 18th century had of the East. Who would have thought that those people wearing long Chinese robes not only had European features, but also acted with familiar mannerisms? The porcelain painting they were drawing had figures with Western facial features, yet Chinese outfits from the Qing dynasty. The blue and white porcelain vase is identical to the one in the porcelain collection in the Dresden Castle. In 2012, 55-year-old Chinese-American painter Yu Chunming came to Nanchang University to teach Western painting. At the same time, he brought back a large number of Chinese porcelain sold abroad for the University Museum collection. To him, these porcelain items are history textbooks that will never be eroded. This red porcelain plate from the Yongzheng era was painted with a picture of Jesus being baptized. The cherubs decorating the side look distinctly like Chinese children. Even Jesus looks like an Easterner. This wasn't just Christianity. Envy. 10 years later, he supplemented this letter with another one, around 7,000 words long.
When they were published in French and in English, they were published in French first, and then a couple of years later in English. They were sort of devoured by porcelain makers in Europe as being the most authentic account of how Chinese porcelain was made.
The interesting thing is, Lang Tingji and d'Entrecourt came and left at almost the same time. In 1712, he was promoted to Viceroy of Liangjiang and left Jingde town. The following year, on Emperor Kangxi's 60th birthday, a banquet was held at Changchun Garden for days on end. There is reason to believe the famous long kiln porcelain was a birthday present for the emperor. "14 years after Lang Tingji left, Jingde town welcomed Nian Xiyao, appointed by Yongzheng as porcelain supervising officer. 2 years later, Tang Ying also arrived in Jingde town. He served under both emperors Yongzheng and Tianlong and supervised the Tang kiln for over 20 years. He was the most prolific of the 4 great supervising officers in the Qing dynasty. He not only satisfied Qianlong's pursuit for perfect porcelain, he also brought Chinese porcelain to a whole new level. This 86.4 centimeter tall porcelain vase, exhibited in the Forbidden Palace in Beijing, was made during Qianlong's regime. It was glazed with a total of 15 kinds of glazes, 16 text decorations and 12 color paintings. Complete with almost all the porcelain features of the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. Its complication and perfection makes it, to this day, one of a kind. It is difficult to even name it accurately. Thus it is simply called the Mother of Porcelain by the public, in reference to its comprehensive collection of everything great about Chinese porcelain. Although the craft of porcelain making had already been leaked at the time, and various countries in Europe and Asia were gradually setting up porcelain factories, they were still far behind China in both the scale and quality of their work, and was far from meeting the great demand. Thus, total porcelain export in the Qing dynasty still reached an extreme in history. After Butger manufactured original porcelain for his master Augustus II, this legendary king still exchanged over 100 porcelain pieces from the Kangxi regime with 600 of his elite dragoons. To King Augustus II, the original Chinese porcelain had been deified. And in both the East and the West, the story of porcelain appeared to be ongoing. In the 5 years after 1717, England, as the newest dominating power at sea, transported over 1 million porcelain pieces out of China with its 6 merchant ships from the East India Company. In 1730, they bought another 500,000 plus pieces. Until the end of the 18th century, Jingde town, despite having 3,000 kilns, was still unable to meet the great demand.
This was something the Westerners couldn't master. It was something they didn't have. They were amazed by how advanced this Chinese craft was, so they exported it in massive amounts to Europe.
In the Porcelain Museum in Jingde town, there is also an enormous Fantai vase, which was painted with a real event. In 1793, the King of England sent Macartney to lead a diplomatic corps with their blessings on Emperor Qianlong's birthday, but with the ulterior motive of lifting the ban on maritime trade. However, the Qing dynasty, at the peak of its prosperity, remained unmoved, still indulging in its conceited arrogance. No wonder, then, that this porcelain vase was named 8 Barbarians Offering Treasure. Macartney failed on his mission, but the desire to covet remained. Guangzhou Port, the dominating superport in China. In ancient times, it was one of the 3 major ports of China's Silk Road on the sea. After the Qing dynasty banned maritime trade, it became the only existing port for foreign trade in the so-called single port trade. But even with just one port, modern trade flourished. Guangcai originated from Guangdong's colored porcelain, but its greenware actually still came from Jingde town. However, Guangdong was more convenient for foreign merchants. allowing them to send the models or colored paintings of the porcelain items they wanted directly to the porcelain factories. The factories could paint and fire the porcelain immediately, then pack them for export and complete the business transaction. As ship after ship of porcelain and tea were exported, boatloads of silver were sent in. The Westerners complained that the Chinese didn't seem to need anything other than silver. Englishman Sir Robert Hart, Customs Inspector General for the Qing dynasty for half a century, wrote in his book, "These from the land of Sinim. China has the best food in the world, rice, the best drink, tea, the best clothes, silk. They have no need to buy anything from others." If we added porcelain, the best utensil there was, to this list, the Chinese could have completely sealed itself off back then. Thus, most merchant ships from the West came empty and returned full of goods.
A society that was starting to prosper would pursue new and fashionable things, and that was when porcelain came in.
The prosperous age of Kangxi created one of the longest ages of prosperity in Chinese history. However, these 100 years were also the last days of glory in China's over 2,000 years of feudal history. The world was getting smaller, and the rules of the game had changed. The Qing dynasty's mammoth ways of sticking its head in the sand had been seen through by sharp-eyed falcons, and a bloody banquet was about to begin. In 1799, the last year of the 18th century, the oldest emperor in Chinese history, Emperor Qianlong, passed away. As the sun set and the flock dispersed, China entered the most complicated, transient, and emotional 19th century. To the various foreign powers, the Qing dynasty was like an enormous porcelain product, grand, glamorous, intricate, charming, hard yet vulnerable, beautiful and fragile. They could take advantage of it through trade or conquer it by force. The global Chinese craze that lasted throughout the Qing dynasty burned through this alternately civil and violent contest. At uncontrolled high temperatures, unpredictable changes might occur in the kiln, no matter what the porcelain was glazed with. At that same period, the English finally found the black silver they wanted: opium. Another century passed by in a flash. It wasn't a long time in the history of porcelain development, yet it was a world-changing century. The long road of porcelain has gone from one wide path to a crisscross patchwork of paths that will make your head spin. As a manufacturing material, porcelain no longer needs protection as a sort of heritage, because its life has long transcended any boundaries, more than any ancient inventor had ever imagined. Only the cultural distinctions attached to it make up its irreplaceable DNA. Li Jianshen left to study abroad after graduating from Jingde Town's Porcelain Academy. Even he never imagined he would be back in Jingde Town a few years later to set up his own porcelain workshop.
As a core vessel of Chinese culture, porcelain carries with it 5,000 years of Chinese cultural heritage. It's history you can touch, a kind of memory you can feel with your own hands.
Indeed, D'Entrecol secretly learned how to make porcelain from Jingde Town, and Butger figured out the skills to make porcelain himself. But did they ever think about the unbreakable ties between porcelain and Chinese culture? Civilization needs soil, and so does Li Jianshan. As both a practical tool and art for appreciation, no one ever imagined that porcelain, on the day it was invented, that it would become so closely intertwined with the progress of Chinese history and human civilization. It could reach the emperor and enter the sacred halls. It could be used by civilians in the kitchen. If the four great inventions of China were tactics to promote the spread of civilization, then China's silk, tea, and porcelain were together witnesses of all cultural changes over time. Even when smashed into pieces and covered in mud and sand, the cultural message attached to porcelain will never fade. Some people believed in the artistic value of porcelain, while some saw its business potential. It is, indeed, history that one can touch. Whether of its own volition or not, porcelain has already come off its pedestal and penetrated every corner of the world. It is history on exhibition shelves. It is reality on the coffee table. It is the future that crosses through space and time.